Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Germain, and I thought I'd do a little video lesson for the newer skydivers out there about approach planning. So if you go to a new drop zone or you go to the old drop zone and the winds have changed and you need to plan out your pattern, there's some science that you can apply. There's some predictive models that will be very, very helpful. And so the first thing I want to show you here is you can go to Google Maps. So the airport that I've chosen to make a jump into here is Skydive Sussex, and that's in northern New Jersey. And here is the main landing area. So to get an idea of, first of all, how far the parachute's gonna go, we need to here. I'm just going to use this as a way to look at the numbers based on the glide ratio. So if I mark the center of the target, I just did a right click, and then I click again over here. So we can measure the distance really easily just looking down here, and from that you can ask the question, how far does my parachute go for each 100 feet of descent? So the glide ratio of the canopy on a no-wind day may be somewhere between 2.5 to 1 and 3 to 1 if you're on a student canopy. So what that means is if you're on final approach at 100 feet, you're going to go 300 feet across the ground on a student parachute. And if it's a little bit smaller, you won't go quite as far. And so let's look at what it would be for a turn point somewhere out here on a student canopy on an absolutely no wind day if you've already completed the turn and the dynamics have settled out. In other words, when you make a turn, you lose glide ratio and the canopy will sort of oscillate a little bit on the pitch axis, which is nose up, nose down. And so the glide ratio is kind of hard to predict there, but you know that from the turn itself, from base leg to final, you're going to lose something. And so let's say it's somewhere in the vicinity of 100 feet. Depends on the steepness of the turn. If you do a brake turn or a descending turn, and how you release that turn. Do you let up the brake quickly or do you let it up slowly? Massive differences there. But this will give you a rough idea on a student parachute versus a 2.5 to 1 glide ratio canopy, about 750 feet for a 2.5 to 1 if you turn final at 300 feet. And then we're going to shave something off of that as well. So this is a reasonable guess for how far you're going to go if there's absolutely no wind. From there, you have to, of course, incorporate the winds, which will reduce the ground speed of the parachute if you turn into the wind for landing, which is usually a good idea, but not always. So there's a lot to talk about there. But let's say the parachute's ground speed is somewhere around 20 miles an hour. If the winds are 10, that's going to reduce this length by half. All right, so it'll be put it somewhere around the edge of the field at this little fuzzy tree here. Actually, it's not that fuzzy if I give it a minute to render. So that'll give me kind of a pretty good idea for a 10-mile-an-hour wind, how far that's going to go. And then the base leg will be similar in length to my let's see, that 800-foot that measurement that I figured out for the no wind day on the base leg. If I turn early and I let it drift, so here's my downwind leg. If I turn early and I point my parachute perpendicular to the wind line, I will drift sideways, in this case to my right. And the distance that I'll go across the wind line will be very similar to what it would be on a no wind day. So my base leg doesn't change in length unless I decide I want to do a ferry pattern where I'm moving myself across the wind line. In other words, I have to turn into the wind a little bit so that I'm moving diagonally to my right. That will shorten this distance, and that's because it's reducing my ground speed by not pointing where I'm actually going. That's why I call it a ferry, like you're ferrying a boat across the river. And so this distance is now shorter on the base leg, and of course the length of my downwind leg will be longer because there's a tailwind. If this was a totally no wind scenario, here, let's remove this. If I had absolutely no wind, it would be somewhere, on a student canopy, it could be this big, right? And it would all be square sides. This is an approximation, but it's pretty close. And then if the wind was half that speed, this would go to here, that would go to here, this will come in, and this needs to move out. And if I move it too far out by accident, I can always ride brakes or rear risers to extend my distance that I would travel from the way I prescribe 900 feet down to 600, my downwind leg. Better a little bit too far away on this leg than too short, because if you're too close, then you get to this point with too much altitude, this point with too much altitude, and you end up overshooting into the hard ground, the embarrassing places. So this is just kind of a rough idea of what to expect. And I'm going to set up a simulation now that will be very helpful. I think you'll like this. So I'm going to share the screen so you can see my virtual reality simulator using Skydive VR. I haven't found anything that teaches canopy flight quite as effectively, because it's based on fly site data, real data collected based on parachutes in flight. So I've got now, the wind is going in the direction that I said at 10 knots, and I'm going to go with a little stronger wind up higher, which is pretty common, and I'm going to be exiting upwind of the target. Let's do a long spot just for fun, just to show how far you can actually go if you've got a 14-knot tailwind. So the holding area should be somewhere up here. I wouldn't recommend crossing the runway too much. And this is where you're going to, some people call it the play box, where you're going to hang out this way until you're down below 2,000 feet. Landing pattern would be something about like this. And we said this is going to be a shorter base leg because I do have some wind, and I'm going to fly a pre-base leg. So at 1,200 feet, I'm going to be upwind of the target, directly upwind of the target, and fly a full box. I find that really helps to dial in how long my base leg is by flying a pre-base leg. I really do this. So let's let it rip. And see if you can learn. Now, of course, I'm using the desktop version, and that allows me to work on all different things and kind of dial it in and freeze frame and all that. But when you use the VR goggles and the controllers with bungee cords, oh, it's so realistic. It's amazing. All right, so I can look all around. It's frozen right now. I can see the winds. I can see that I'm upwind of the target. And to start the simulation, I'm going to hit either the A or D key, which are the keys that I use for steering. So we're open up. I'm starting a right turn. Remember, I've got to look into the turn, look for the traffic sort of down to that side. Canopy turns left. I don't see any traffic. Looks good. Let's see if the parachute flares. So a little bit of brakes, full brakes. Yep. So it pitches nicely. Nobody's in front of me. Let's check altimeter, 4,600 feet. So I'm upwind of the target. And one of the things that I find is very helpful is to turn on the hotkeys. So I've got these little keys that will give me, first of all, that white dot on the ground. That's where I am. That is my location. And it's also indicating from the sort of pointy part of the circle precisely where I'm moving. So right now, this is a holding crab. I'm facing into the wind sufficiently that I'm moving directly across the wind line. Another really cool tool, because people get confused about airspeed and ground speed. And so this is a really wonderful thing to be able to demonstrate. I'm going to turn on the relative wind. So right now, the relative wind, the airflow that I feel under canopy, the energy that's giving my parachute the ability to maneuver, that's caused by my motion through the air mass, is coming from the front always. But down to my right is my projected landing point, that green spot with the laser beam coming out of it. That's my where I will land if I don't change anything. Looking at the ground, of course, I can see that white dot pointing directly towards the green dot. So right now I'm upwind of the target, right where I want to be, and I'm going to turn into the wind. And what I'll notice here is that my location of landing is not a real high angle. It's not a 2.5 or 3-to-1 glide. It's more like a 1-to-1 glide, but the bubbles are still coming from the same place. If I was to flare, that would change the angle of the bubbles because I've changed aerodynamically where I'm going through the air mass. However, navigationally speaking, the sum total of my parachute's ground speed, descent rate, and the wind, I now have a very different landing point. So let's turn 90 degrees and just sort of do some experiments. Observe what's going on. I'm at 2,900 feet. And just for a moment, I'm going to pause this because I've noticed that my face is covering up the altimeter and descent rate. So I'm going to unpause now, let it rip. Actually, it's kind of neat where you can see where the wind is going when I pause. So I'm motionless in space, but the wind isn't. All right, so now I'm trucking again. Let's have a look at what happens when I turn into a run. Right, so I've banked off towards where I want to go. I'm headed towards the target in terms of my heading. The airflow is coming from a point that's above that. So even on a no-wind day, I would be able to make it back. But with that additional ground speed caused by the tailwind, you can see the green dot is way over there in the distance. Well, what if I was to add a little bit of brakes? All right, so I'm going to pull down the brakes so they're just a little bit down. And I'm going to extend the distance somewhat. Let's let it off for comparison. So I go a little bit further when I add a little bit of brakes in the simulation. But what if I was to add deep brakes? Give it a moment where you can see the airspeed slows down. I can't even see the point. I'm going to land on the other side of those hills. So that's pretty cool. So I have the ability, turning back into the wind, I have the ability to extend my distance on the downwind leg. And that's something I can use when I'm in the pattern. Now, keep in mind, if you're in a run, headed downwind from 900 to 600 or roughly, if you go to deep brakes, you will extend your glide ratio. However, the person that's flying behind you may not be so happy about it. So it's still a good idea to fly a good pattern so you don't have to do those things. And I think it's really wise to use rear risers instead when you're in the pattern if you need to flatten out your glide ratio. All right, so let's turn a little bit further here so I can see the landing area, and I'm going to pause. I'm going to bring up the landing pattern. All right, so this is where I guess, this is not a perfect spot, but it's not bad for a 10-mile-an-hour wind, or I should say 10 knots per hour. Upwind of the target, if this is my wind line, directly upwind. If there was no wind, I would start at 1,200 here, but if it was a little bit of wind, I might start here. So I'm displacing myself upwind to accommodate for the fact that I will now have a longer downwind leg and a shorter final approach. But because it is pretty windy, I'm going to start way up here, and I want to be here at 12. I want to be here at 9, and then I'm going to just sort of get a sense of how far am I going, how fast am I going, and then I'll make my amendments. If I'm way too far away, I would choose to ride the brakes in the simulator, and that's only because they don't have rear risers functional yet in the Skydive VR. But if I had that option, that's what I would choose. And if I don't have enough altitude, in other words, the ground speed is too slow, I might choose to also cut off this corner and sort of round things out to the inside. I'm turning towards the inside of the pattern. As I'm flying this downwind leg, I might feel that I've got too much altitude, in which case I can lean this to the outside and add some distance to my base leg. If that's not sufficient and it still looks like I'm going to overshoot, I turn away and I add some to my final approach. If I then have a problem, I can go to the outside here and then back in, provided there's no traffic. I would never go to the inside and back out because that creates a traffic problem. So let's get rid of all that stuff, and I'm going to start the simulation again. And 1,400 feet, I'm going to bring myself around into the wind looking for the traffic. I don't see any traffic right now. So I'm in about the right location at about the right altitude. I can't be certain that it's perfect, but it's not bad. So now I have to patiently let it drift slowly across the wind line. Slow because I'm not pointed where I'm going, because I'm crabbing. This is a holding crab. And at 900 feet, which turns out to coincide with my intercept with the road, I'm turning downwind and I'm looking at the target and I'm checking to the outside for traffic. People can be coming from there too. Now I'm looking at that target, but I don't want to drift towards it. I want to fly straight downwind. And I can see my ground track is straight. 600 feet, I'm going to start my turn to base leg. The angles look pretty good. Doing a turn, starting a little bit on the early side. Whenever there's wind, it's wise to start a little too early so that you don't go too far from the target, because getting back is not going to happen, right? All I could do is add rear risers. So I'm not going to modify things very much here. I'm just going to let it fly. The model worked, so I turned about 300 feet back towards the target, and let's get a sense of where I'm going to land. This would be perfectly acceptable. I think most people would be pretty happy with the accuracy here. 100 feet is the last I would do any major maneuvering, including rear risering to extend to the target, because if you hold your rear risers until you're too close to the ground, you can find yourself either taking in too deep and stalling, that would be bad news, or when you let your hands back up after holding those rear risers down, the canopy wants to surge and dive towards the ground, and you can have an ineffective flare because the lines go slack when the canopy surges forward on the pitch axis. So what I'm going to do now is see what needed to be done to make this perfect. So I'm going to rewind. So if I was here, there's not much I can do other than rear riser. If I was here, right, where I'm on the base leg, well, I can fix that, right? So let's prove that I can fix that by cutting to the inside of the pattern a little bit. So I'm turning a little bit towards the target to cut down that distance, looking for traffic. And let's observe what that little change did. So right now it looks like I'm on a path to more or less go to the target, maybe slightly overshoot. Because remember, when you flare, the canopy will drift. So at 160 feet, going to deep brakes in traffic would be a fool's choice. However, I don't have any traffic, so I'm going to demonstrate what going to brakes would be. So I'm getting down to 100 feet, so I'm going to let off the brakes because I want to have a good flare. And look, that it worked. Now, it worked a little too well, but you get the idea. So I'm going to rewind and see if I can fix this in other ways. So if I was to rewind all the way back to here on the downwind leg, I'm just beginning my downwind leg. So I might not go so far, or I might displace a little bit towards the target now if I wanted to. That would work. Let's make the turn just a little bit earlier than before, because remember, I'm still drifting sideways. See my side slide? Right now, I'm drifting at the speed of the wind away from the target until I get her around a little bit into the wind, and then you'll see that ground track change. All right, so now I'm looking down to my left, and an important idea at this phase of the approach, when you're not quite into the wind, you're still making that turn, is to really look at the target and get a sense of the glide angle of the canopy. So you can do a test when you're between 1,500 and 2,000 or so, where you face into the wind, upwind of the target in your location, and then observe the glide angle of the canopy today with this parachute, this wind speed, this wing loading, the whole context. And that'll help me to predict where I need to put that target in terms of the angle, and so that I can, kind of be pretty close. And from there, you might make some little changes. Now, as you're doing this, you may want to look around, see if there's any more traffic, right? And possibly get rid of some extra altitude. Right now, I don't think I need to get rid of any extra altitude because I'm looking pretty good. The flare should cause me to move forward over to the target. Maybe it'll cause me to drift over it, but the winds are strong enough that perhaps not. And let's see how we do. Flare, float, over. Good enough. 11 feet. Hey, look at that. 11 feet. My vertical landing speed is 11. It's because I flared a little bit high, but the simulator doesn't flare very, very well. And the horizontal speed was almost 0. We also have the ability to look at the flight path, just like you would analyze FlySight data or use SkyDuck or one of these tools. So I'm into the wind here at 1800. I was looking at the glide ratio. Now I hooked myself back around, boom, entering. I'm bleeding off a little bit of extra altitude because I was a little bit too high at that location. And now I'm crabbing across the wind line, 900 feet, turning downwind, trying to stay square to the wind line. Looks like I angled it away a little bit. I think I was referencing the road. And now base leg, and then final approach, bump to the target. Now, it's important to note, right? Your turns are not square angles. And you have the ability within each turn to modify the way that it loses altitude in that turn. And that can really help your accuracy. And if you ignore it, it'll hurt it. So pay attention to all of these little details. And I think you'll find that it really does help, because accuracy matters, you know? I mean, it really, really, really matters. And if you're to just make that a goal, you know, don't beat yourself up if you miss the target. You know, you land a little bit far away and you learn the lesson. You know, don't shame yourself, forgive yourself, and then input that new data into your equation, you know, for your next jump. All right, I was a little off. I was short or I was long. Those are the two possibilities, right? You know, where did I end up and why did I end up there? And go back up there and do it again. Because if you can't land where you want to, eventually you're going to land someplace you really don't want to. So if you enjoyed this and you would like to learn more about parachute flight, I run 3 online sessions every week, at least an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. We do Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So you can join the membership program through the link in the bottom of this video. It's $25 a month. It's not very much, and I promise you it'll be worth it. At the very least, even if you can't make it to the sessions, on that private website, you'll find like 400 hours of discussions, of simulations, of question and answer, and all kinds of very useful things in becoming a skydiver. It's all about the information. And I just wanted to make it easier for you. You know, I know it is hard to learn how to jump out of airplanes. There's a lot to know. And you got to fill up your knowledge bucket before your luck bucket runs out. So I hope to see you at one of the live sessions. And I thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
I love my job.